The day humans stopped knowing where they were. Open your Maps app. Type in an address. Watch the blue dot appear. You already know what comes next. The turn by turn, the little arrow, the voice telling you when to move. You've done this so many times, it takes about 3 seconds. And in those 3 seconds, you are using a technology that has quietly deleted one of the oldest cognitive abilities the human brain ever developed. Not weakened it, not reduced it, deleted it. The ability is called spatial navigation, and for 300,000 years, it was one of the things that made you human. To understand what was lost, you have to go back to before there were roads. For most of human history, knowing where you were was a survival skill in the most literal sense, not a convenience, not a preference. If you got lost, you died. It was that simple. And so the human brain, over hundreds of thousands of years, built an internal system so sophisticated that neuroscientists are still mapping it. You have cells in your hippocampus, a region deep in the center of your brain that fire in specific patterns depending on where you are in physical space. They are called place cells. They were discovered in 1971 by neuroscientist John O'Keefe, work that would eventually win him a Nobel Prize. But that's only half the system. In 2005, a husband and wife research team, May Britt and Edvard Moser, discovered a second layer, a different set of cells in a neighboring region that fire in a precise triangular grid across any environment you move through. They called them grid cells. Together, place cells and grid cells function like a biological GPS, a constantly updating internal map that tracks where you are, where you've been, and how to get back. It runs automatically. It never needs a signal, and it gets stronger the more you use it. Here's what nobody talks about. That system is use-dependent. It grows with navigation, and it shrinks without it. In 2000, neuroscientist Eleanor Maguire published a study that became one of the most cited in the history of brain research. She scanned the brains of London taxi drivers. At the time, to earn a license in London, you had to memorize the layout of 25,000 streets and 20,000 landmarks entirely from scratch, a process that took most people 3 to 4 years of daily navigation practice. It was called the knowledge. Maguire found that the taxi drivers had significantly larger hippocampal volume than matched controls. The longer a driver had been doing the job, the larger the difference. The brain had physically grown in response to navigational demand. And when drivers retired and stopped navigating, the hippocampus shrank back. The organ was responding to use like a muscle responds to exercise. And like a muscle, it atrophied when the exercise stopped. That's not the interesting part. The interesting part is what the hippocampus does beyond navigation. The same region of the brain that builds your internal map also consolidates long-term memory, regulates spatial reasoning, and is one of the first structures to deteriorate in Alzheimer's disease. The hippocampus is not just your GPS, it is one of the primary organs of cognition. And for 300,000 years, daily navigation was the thing that kept it active. In 2017, researchers at University College London ran an experiment. They gave 2 groups of participants the same task: navigate through a virtual simulation of central London. One group used GPS turn-by-turn instruction. The other navigated freely, using their own judgment and memory. When the researchers scanned their brains afterward, the GPS group showed almost no hippocampal activation at all. The brain had not been asked to navigate, so it didn't. It had simply executed instructions, the same way a hand executes a command from a remote control. The GPS group had traveled the same distance through the same city and arrived at the same destination, but their brains had done almost none of the work. GPS was introduced to civilian use in 1995. Smartphone navigation arrived in 2007 with the first iPhone. By 2015, roughly 3 billion people were using it regularly. That is the fastest adoption of a navigation technology in human history, and it happened in less than 1 human generation. The brain did not have time to adapt. It simply offloaded the function to the device. But here's where it gets strange. Researchers began noticing something in the data that nobody had predicted. People who relied heavily on GPS were not just navigating worse when the app was taken away. They were showing broader cognitive changes. A 2020 study published in Nature Communications tracked navigation behavior and cognitive performance in 397,000 people across 38 countries. It found that people who reported using GPS heavily showed measurably lower spatial reasoning scores, and that the effect was not explained by age, education, or baseline intelligence. Device was doing something to the brain beyond just making navigation easier. And then researchers asked a question nobody wanted to hear the answer to. If GPS is reducing hippocampal activation, and the hippocampus is one of the first regions to show decline in dementia, what does a generation of GPS-dependent navigation do to long-term cognitive health? No one knows yet. The technology is too new and the timescale too long, but the hypothesis is sitting there in the literature, and the neuroscientists who study it are not dismissing it. There's a word for what was lost, and it's older than any map. Wayfinding. Indigenous cultures around the world developed wayfinding systems of staggering precision. Polynesian navigators crossed thousands of miles of open ocean using star positions, wave patterns, bird behavior, and the feel of swells beneath a canoe hull. They carried no instruments. They needed none. The Marshall Islanders built stick charts, physical models of wave patterns between islands, not to carry on voyages, to memorize and then leave behind. The map was internalized before departure. The brain was the instrument. Aboriginal Australians developed a system called songlines, routes across the continent encoded in oral song, each verse describing terrain, landmarks, water sources, and distance. A person who knew the song could navigate hundreds of miles of unfamiliar country. The landscape and the memory were fused into one thing. Navigation was not separate from knowledge. It was knowledge. These systems took generations to build and passed on something the GPS cannot replicate. A relationship between a person and the physical world that ran through the body, not around it. In 2019, a team of researchers at McGill University studied Inuit hunters in northern Canada, one of the last populations still practicing traditional wayfinding across genuinely unmarked terrain. They found that the hunters used dozens of simultaneous environmental cues: wind direction, snow texture, star position, animal movement, in a constant fluid recalibration that never stopped. Their internal maps were not static. They were alive, updating in real time, integrated with everything around them. When the researchers tested their spatial memory and hippocampal function, the results looked nothing like the average urban adult. The structures were larger, the function was faster, and the hunters were not young. Several were in their 60s and 70s. The brains of people who navigated the way humans navigated for 300,000 years looked fundamentally different from the brains of people who used GPS. Here's what that means for you. You are not broken. You did not choose this. The technology arrived, it was useful, and you used it. The same way every human before you adopted every tool that made survival easier. That is not weakness. That is what the species does. But the cost of this tool is not visible on a screen, and it was never disclosed. Nobody told you that offloading navigation to a device would reduce activation in one of the most important structures in your brain. Nobody ran that study before 3 billion people started using it. The ability to know where you are, truly know it, without a signal, without a battery, without a satellite, is not a party trick. It is 300,000 years of cognitive infrastructure. It is the thing that kept your ancestors alive in landscapes that had no signs, no roads, no voice telling them when to turn. It is embedded in the same region of your brain that holds your long-term memories and scaffolds your ability to think in space and time. And most people reading this have not exercised it in years. The blue dot always knows where you are. The question nobody asked when we handed it that job is what happens to the